This next fly we'll tie is a Clouser Minnow. This is, again, one of the most popular streamers around. A super simple fly. It's essentially a bucktail jig tied on a fly hook. We're going to tie this on a 4X long Tiemco 9395. It's a ring eye hook with the straight eye. Makes the fly track a little better in the water. And it's a 3 extra heavy hook, so it's very stout, will hold up to big fish. I'm going to use 3/0 monocord to tie the fly. We're going to use some medium-sized lead eyes that I've painted red with a black pupil, and chartreuse and white bucktail for the body. We're going to add a little bit of crystal flash in the center to make a little lateral line down the side of this little bait fish. And of course you can tie this fly in all the colors of the rainbow, all white, chartreuse and white, red and white, blue and white, any sort of different color combinations. Usually a darker color over white, although that's not limiting by any factor. To start on this fly, I'm going to start the thread just behind the eye. We're going to tie most of this fly on the front half of the hook. So I'm going to make a thread base just down the front half of the hook. I'll run back forward again to about 25% of the way toward the hook eye. So I'm about 1/4 of the shank back and 3/4 of the way forward. And at this point I'm going to take my lead eyes and I'm going to X-wrap these in. You can see my threads unwinding after that thread base. So I'm going to let that flatten out a bit. And I'm going to lay these lead eyes in and I'm going to take 5 or 6 turns over the eyes at an angle. Now I'm going to grab the near eye and sort of pry it in line and go 5 or 6 turns the other direction, tightening that down so that those eyes are set perpendicular to the hook shank. Now I like to make several turns to really lock these eyes in, and we'll even add a little shot of glue. So I'm going to go back and make a few more wraps the other direction and a few more wraps crossing back again, and then I'll come around the hook. Now one thing I'll do to tighten eyes like this down, so I'm going to take what's called a parachute wrap around the base of the eyes. And you can see this wrap is not going around the hook shank, but just around the wraps that I made around the eyes. That'll cinch those wraps down tighter so those eyes don't move. We want to make sure those eyes stay centered on the hook. I'm going to move the thread back. I'm going to continue my thread base back just a touch further. Now while we're here, I'm going to put just a very light coat of some Zap-A-Gap here on the eyes just to further lock them down. And I'll turn the hook over and put a little shot on the bottom as well. Now you can see I've wrapped my thread base back to about the midpoint now, but I've got the thread touched a little further forward. I want to make sure that I'm tying our first bunch of bucktail down along the hook shank on top of a thread base. I'm going to pick out a little clump of white bucktail. And one of the keys on tying a Clouser Minnow is to keep the fly relatively sparse. This hair will move really nicely in the water. It doesn't take a lot of bulk. It's a rather transparent pattern when it's all said and done. So I'm going to take a clump of bucktail like so. I'll grab the longest ends and kind of pull out the short stuff. But I don't want to stack this hair. I don't want a nice square end to it like we do on a lot of dry fly wings. I want sort of a ragged, tapering down, wispy end to this hair. I'll take this and measure it against the hook. And the proportions on this fly are somewhat subjective. We've got a long hook, so I'm going to make a little bit longer fly out of this. We could make a much shorter fly. We could come as short as this here, which is about 1.5 shank lengths, or we can go as long as 2 or 3 shank lengths. But we're going to keep this fly sort of medium. So I'll measure in here. So I'm going to go maybe about 2 shank lengths. And I'll lay this hair down. And I tie this a little differently than Bob had originally. I'm going to make a band of thread behind the eyes to anchor this hair down. And I didn't quite come all the way up to the eyes. You can see that hair's stopped a little short of the eyes. And I'm going to jump my thread to the front of the eyes. And see how I cross the eyes on the bottom of the hook? That'll eliminate any big loose strand of thread that will jump from one side to the other of the eyes. An exposed loose strand of thread is just asking for the fly to come apart. Now I'm going to take these buttons and I'm going to lay them down in front of the eyes and catch them with a couple turns of thread. And I can anchor down. Now we're going to come in and cut those buttons at a bit of an angle here. So I'm going to lift these up and I'm going to come in from the front and cut at an upward angle. Then I'm going to wrap down over those butt ends. You can see how that'll just smoothly taper down to the hook eye. We've got plenty of room for the thread head now. Now I'm going to turn the hook over in the vise, and you can do this a couple of different ways. You could move your vise so that you've got a true rotary. You could just flip it over like this, but it's at a bit of an odd angle on this. So what I'm going to do is actually grab the hook and just turn it upside down in the vise. That'll keep things centered. I actually find it's just as fast to do that as it is to set my vise in a different position. So this is typically how I'll do them. I'll just flip the hook over. This fly is made to ride hook point up. Those lead eyes will counterweight the hook and flip it over. So the top color is going to be tied on the bottom of the hook, but the fly will ride as it's sitting here now. Now before we add our top wing, we're going to add just a few strands of flash in, and there's a little trick to tying flash in on any sort of streamer fly like this. I'm going to take 3 or 4 strands of, in this case it's silver crystal flash, but you could use pearl or any variety of colors. And I'm going to stagger the ends a bit. I don't want them all cut to the exact same length. I want this about twice as long as the fly, maybe a touch longer. And what I'll do here is I'm going to take this flash, I'm going to hold it right at its center, and I'll put my thread over the top of it. So I've just pinched the flash up against the thread. Then I can fold that flash over where it's looped around the thread. Now as I come up, I'll bring my thread up and over, and I can drop that flash down right on top of the fly and wrap back over it. This flash is a soft, flat plastic material, and it doesn't anchor in very well if I just tied the loose ends down. Looping it like this assures that it will never come out. It makes a much more durable fly. You can see that these butt ends of the flash are going to be just a touch longer than the bucktail, and I do want them to peek out just a little bit. So we've got just about the right length there. If I needed to trim that, I would trim those to random lengths. I don't want them all cut off at one point. Now I'm going to take a little clump of chartreuse bucktail, about the same size as what we used of the white. I'll trim that off the hide. And again, I'll clean it out like we have all the other hairs. If you've got anything extra long, I might maybe preen the tips just a little bit. But we want to stick with the pretty sparse bunch. And I'll take this bunch of hair and I can measure it under the hook here to make sure it's at least as long as the white, if not just a slight bit longer. I'm going to bump this back just a little bit to make sure I've got plenty of length. And I'll lay this in on top of the hook. While I've got it in this hand, I'm going to make the wrap with my material hand and just get a couple turns of thread over it. I'm going to put just a few more in there, and then I'm going to press down on this hair to make sure it's centered on top of the hook. I want it to cover that void across the top of the fly. I'll anchor that down good and tight with several more tight turns, and then I'm going to trim these hairs the same way that we did the white bunch, at a bit of an angle. And you can see how that'll help to taper the head down in a nice smooth fashion there. So I'll wrap down to the hook eye, and then I'll work back and forth a couple of times just to smooth everything off. I'll run the thread to the back of the head, and this is where I'll whip finish. 4 or 5 turns there. And clip your thread. And once I pull this out, we can kind of position that hair in and around the hook point. And that's our little Clouser Minnow.